Hello, I'm Judy Stiles. Thank you for joining us for Spotlight on Senior Issues. This series of programs looking at topics of interest to the fastest growing population segment, senior citizens. Whether you're a senior or have a family member who is, we hope this series will help you find out some more information and resources. Today we're focusing on a topic that we all have to deal with, whether we're seniors or not, funeral planning. And joining me, CK Warden, funeral director, as well as Kelly's with us again. Thank you for being here again today, Kelly.
Thank you.
We're talking about funerals, and that's something that a lot of people really don't talk about. It's, a lot of families are sitting around talking, what do you want to do? So do you encounter this oftentimes, finding that it's a topic that people don't talk about in advance?
Yes. As Kelly and I have talked about, the topic doesn't come up until people are in crisis.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not necessarily a good time to start getting your education. So there are some things that you can do to educate yourself, to make some plans, and I believe that an informed consumer is obviously a much better consumer, but it's good for the industry, I believe, for a consumer to be informed. Especially in this area, it's the lack of willingness to talk about it creates this tyranny of silence. Mm-hmm. And so glad to be here to talk about it.
Yeah, well, hopefully in this program, this half hour, we can help with maybe at least start that education process for people to gather that. And I guess we need to go back to some of the basics. When someone's having a funeral, what are some of the basic questions? Who's a funeral for?
Yes, the obviously the funeral is actually for the survivors.
Mm-hmm. Right.
We're dealing with disposition of human remains, and that has to be dealt with. But I really think that the funeral industry needs to focus more on being a wellness industry. Wellness for the immediate family, wellness for the community, and less focus on the disposition and the profitability. I think in this industry, like your industry and others, if we are not held to a higher standard, if we are not morally holding ourselves accountable, it's easy to slip into a focus on profitability that can be unhealthy for everybody. So it's the family and their needs really need to come first.
So we're talking about
That's
family
very
issues, families,
right.
discussions
Yes.
on this programs today. So
Yes.
like people, family, young members of the family, everyone thinks they need to be aware of when
Right.
situations arrive. Funerals are something that we see. People may not understand how they work, what's involved, and so forth, but there are certain legal guidelines, procedures that, in the industry that people need to be aware of.
Yeah, a good starting point probably is to do some research on the web. There are some great resources. A long time ago, by some people's standards, back in the 70s, the dark ages, the FTC decided that there were some abuses in the industry, really. And they set up some rules for the funeral industry so that people could begin to pick and choose what they wanted and not be charged for things that they weren't using.
Okay.
And so you can go to the FTC website. You can just Google FTC and Google in there the phrase, what should a funeral cost? And then there will be a consumer page come up that gives you some guidance. It'll even give you a checklist of things to kind of look at and consider. But the FTC funeral rule focuses on what a consumer probably needs to know first. So it's a good starting point. One of the primary aspects of the FTC rule is the availability of information. It requires a funeral home to provide a price list to anyone that asks. And that price list isn't necessarily formatted in a certain way, but it has certain requirements. Those things that are optional need to be itemized.
Okay.
And those things that are not optional Every funeral establishment has overhead costs and things that you can't decide not to use. And so there is an option that a funeral home can have a non-declinable overhead fee. But from that point on, they can pick and choose from the different services and products that a funeral home can provide.
So there are a lot of choices when it comes time to planning a funeral.
There are a lot of choices, and there's more variety today than ever. We used to run on a very traditional track, but today people have different ideas of what they want to accomplish, and I think that's a good thing.
So CK, one of the things I think people have gotten a little gun shy of the industry and sort of even the pre-planning. What are some good, that website is great, what are some good guidelines that you can think of to help people select carefully who they're going to use as their funeral planner, and also how do we know that we're doing a good job with our planning versus getting in trouble with our planning, you know?
Yeah. Well,
is it a good idea to
yes,
do, like
planning.
My parents, they have their burial plot and they have their
They've chosen
everything
where they're going to go.
right. They have their stone picked. Everything is already done and they've paid on it for several years and it's already taken care of. Now, my only issue with that would be, you know, if they weren't in the state, then what happens, you know?
Yes, well, the laws have changed in the past few years. It's probably safer now than ever. There have been some debacles in the industry, and there have been cases where funeral homes are no longer in existence, and you can think of it a pre-plan as in two sections. One is the seller, the one who is offering you certain goods and services and showing you a way to pay for that, and the other is the provider.
Okay.
Even the state requires there be a seller's license and a provider's license.
Okay.
I recommend that you do not buy from a third-party seller. I think that's a dangerous practice, but they are out there. I feel that the provider should also be the seller.
Okay.
But by the same token, large corporations have gone bankrupt and left people
High and
Without
dry.
anything to work with.
right. And it's if someone wasn't there to have some sort of a bailout in the process, they would be left with either nothing or certainly not a contract with any guarantees. So. As a consumer, you need to know who you're buying from. You need to ask the hard questions like, what happens if you're no longer here? If you're in a funeral home in front of a funeral director and he says this is a good thing, and you say, well, how do I know you'll be here? You know, a lot of people who are younger than me come talk to me and they'll be around here when I'm not here. So who's gonna provide when I'm not here?
Right.
How do the laws protect the consumer down the road?
Right.
And as I've said, the laws have changed in the last few years, but there are still gray areas. There are still potential problems, and so all of that needs to be well thought out. But here again, pre-planning is not rocket science. The most important part of pre-planning is probably to have a plan.
Have some kind of plan.
In place, have information in place.
Well, and when you're talking about a plan, you know, just the basics of, you know, what do you want in a service, or what are your desires? You recommend people write these things down to share with the family, even if they aren't gathering around the dinner table saying, you know, what do you want to have? You know?
Yeah, I think that again, a good starting point for an individual is to go and ask for a price list. Go to more than one funeral home.
Would have never thought of that.
To go shopping around for a different.
Right.
Yeah,
No one
basically
does.
Go shopping.
Yeah, but it's your right. You might as well exercise your right to go to 2 or 3 places, gather a price list.
It varies. I'm assuming it can vary quite a bit cost-wise.
Yes, it can. If you again go online and ask Google what is an average funeral, you'll get a broad variety of
range, and probably depending on the area in which you live and
Yes.
those communities involved.
So, and we're not probably talking a couple $100. We're probably talking could be thousands, could be.
The National Funeral Directors Association is, the last figures I saw were from almost 5 years ago, and they were saying somewhere around 8,000 per funeral on average.
Mhm.
Now you have to realize that that's averaging in cremation with a memorial service, which would be quite a bit less than that.
Right.
And then a full traditional funeral with casket and vault and burial and stone, and that could be, you know, quite a lot higher than that. So there is a broad variety, but exercise your right. Go ask for a few price lists and start comparing, and ask questions while you're there. Do I need embalming? What is cremation? What are my options in terms of viewing, if I want to have a viewing before the disposition, you know, and you can begin to find out and formulate what the process is going to look like for you and your family.
So the family has communication
So
along these lines.
To use your vernacular, you're creating a care plan for your
There you go.
family.
Good. Well, talking about care, and when a death in the family does occur, we have to start making arrangements. You know, and sometimes you mentioned earlier, you know, sometimes it's a crisis comes along and suddenly we've got to make arrangements. So,
Right.
you know, where do you start? Perhaps even with square one. You had a death in the family; those arrangements need to start being made.
Yes. I used to be a nursing home administrator, and it was my observation with families that were in my care when they lost their loved one there in the nursing home that they immediately were at a loss. They didn't know what the next step was.
Right.
Now what do I do? It's like the mind goes blank. And we had a little format that we had when the family was there. We had a bedside memorial with the chaplain, which was, again, that was me too. But we had the staff, gave them an opportunity for condolences. There was something going on, and then I would talk to the family about the next steps. I would say to them, now I'm going to call the funeral home that you put on your papers when
They fill out the paperwork when they go in there.
when they were brought into the nursing home. That was one of the questions. I said, now we're going to call that funeral home. Is that the funeral home that you still want to use? And they are going to come and be making a removal. Do you want to stay here until they come? You can do that and be here when they come. They're going to call you tomorrow, and they're going to ask you to come in and make arrangements. And so the family then has at least the next few steps.
They have a little roadmap.
In their head.
Right.
And then, of course, the funeral home can take it from there. We have a lot of families these days who take care of their loved ones at home, and so hospice is
Right.
there.
They're a great
Hospice clears up a lot of issues because they're in contact with the doctor. It's
Right.
considered legally an attended death, where if it's an unattended death, then the coroner becomes involved, and the local sheriff or police. But the hospice program clears the way for the family to
Go
kind
to
of
that
take the
next
next
step.
step.
Right.
And so,
And the hospice nurse will even call the funeral, the funeral
Similar
home
he
for
was doing
them.
to help make
Yes.
those first steps along
Yes.
the lines.
Yep.
So once you are dealing with a funeral home, then like you say, you have a lot of decisions to be made. You know, a lot of details, I guess people say, involved in planning the funeral. You mentioned viewing, you mentioned, embalming, and people sometimes may be overwhelmed with what are all these decisions I have to make.
right. And there again, thinking about it beforehand helps.
Yes.
I'm going to suggest something here that you may, at first glance, not like the idea or think it might not be such a good idea, but if you're, as a senior, wanting to sort of think about pre-planning, you might talk to someone who has recently lost someone. And that's a hard subject to bring up, and yet I found that people want to talk about
They want
it
to talk
a week or
about
two
that.
later.
Yeah.
And so if you say to that person, how did that go? What do you think of the funeral
What went
looking back
well?
on it?
What
And
didn't
they are
go so
happy to
well?
talk about it. what was good about it? What did you take away from that you'll always appreciate? What didn't go so well? What would you change? And then listen.
Yeah. Would you recommend that funeral home again?
Would you recommend the funeral home?
Right.
So these are, that's a good resource that is informal and helpful, because I think you're drawing that person out who
Right.
may need to talk about it again at a later date.
Yeah, so you're
That's a
benefiting both parties involved.
Yes.
Yep. The I think the next thing to do is talk about it in your social circle. If you're a part of a small group in a church, let that be a topic sometime. If you have a Sunday school class, let that be a topic. Talk to your minister one-on-one. He conducts funerals,
That's true.
And find out really at that point you can talk to your minister about what role the church can play in the process. Can we use the building?
Right.
Of course, I work in a rural community, and sometimes the best part about the whole 2 or 3 day process is the meal at the church that they provide.
Absolutely.
People are interacting, they're talking. The church is providing a practical ministry that a large family needs at that time.
Yes.
And sometimes that's the best thing that happens through the whole process.
Right.
People are sharing memories. I mean, it's a good moment.
Right.
But in thinking about getting ready for that and being prepared for that, making those arrangements, those are some good resources. The next step probably is to have that talk with your family. If you're a senior, your grown children are not always open to that talk.
Yes.
They'll say, "Oh, Mom, oh, Dad, we don't want to talk about
You're
that.
going to be here forever.
Yeah, so you're fine."
They deny that they're going to have
Right.
to deal with that, right?
But having that talk with them and just say to them, "I've been thinking about this. I've done my research. I've got some price lists. I've talked to my Sunday school class. I've talked to my minister. I've formulated an idea, and here's kind of what I want to do. And I want to make sure that the resources are available to do that it's not a burden on anyone, and that someone is willing to and able to take charge, and then
Spearhead
equip
them.
them to be the one who is in charge."
So it's good to have one person kind of in charge of this whole process that you're
Right.
going to be going through.
Yep. Your funeral director is going to ask you to sign a contract. Well, there's one signature that goes on that. So that may
Who's
be
that
the one
person?
person, yeah. But I've never had a family come in and say, "Wow, I wish Mom would have just let us do all this." They've always been glad that there was a track to run on.
Right.
And now they know the personal wishes, and a follow-through, a faithfulness to follow through on those personal wishes sometimes is one of the healthiest activities that they can.
This
have.
brings up a thought that I had. So, we talk a lot in my industry about having your power of attorney. Well, after death, the power of attorney is no longer in play. So, is there some kind of a legal name for who, because it is not necessarily the power of attorney that's going to do the funeral planning or the funeral arranging, correct?
Right. I have people bring their power of attorney with them to make arrangements, and I have to tell them that's no longer
It's no
applicable.
longer applicable.
That there is, however, what the state would refer to as the right of sepulcher.
Okay.
If there is a formal document, it's more like an attorney in fact than it is a power of attorney.
Okay.
It is, and it supersedes all other relatives. In other words, if you set up a right of sepulcher with someone as an attorney in fact, you are making them your next of kin,
Okay.
and it supersedes all of them. If you're looking at the pecking order there, the right of sepulcher establishes it first
They're
of
at the
all.
top of the list, right?
Okay.
Secondly, and this wouldn't come into play on very many occasions, but occasionally it comes up, the U.S. Army, Navy, Marines.
Military.
When you join the military, you say who is in charge should something happen to you. That person has the right of sepulcher over any other inferior right. Then the rules of consanguinity then apply. A spouse, if there is one, children if they're over 18 and want to accept the financial responsibility, parents, or you know, and if it's a child who passes, then the parent would be the next in
The
line.
one
So
making the arrangements and tying that together.
Yeah.
But when it comes time to
interesting.
with the planning, people will think, well, obituaries, for instance. I've heard some people write their own obituaries
Yeah.
prior to before. And, what do you say when you open up the paper and you see those obituaries? Or we read
Right.
the funeral home postings. And those type of details, try to communicate beforehand as well.
it's good to. I've had a lot of people write their own obituary, the kind of their life story. I've videotaped my wife's grandfather just telling me his story, and we'll probably
wow.
write it from that, how he
Neat.
started in Florida, went to the war,
Right.
and so on. And
That's a great idea.
but to get the story told, you asked about our website. We have an interactive website at our funeral home, and people can actually write stories in, tell stories, and the family, of course, has to approve it before it's seen by the general public. But it's good to tell the stories, obviously.
Yeah, I'm sure that.
So I had a family just a couple of weeks ago, though, who said to me, basically, no offense, but what do we need you for? We've written the obituary. We've taken care of everything at the church. We have people who are in printing business, and we'll do all the printed materials. And they went on and said, "This is what we need you.
These are the only things we need you to do." Right.
What do we need you for?" Because they really weren't sure. And so I said, "Well, I can facilitate this. I can take care of the legal ramifications, and then we'll just keep talking through the process, and we'll decide if you need me or not."
Right.
Right.
But and so a family can take greater charge and greater authority through the process, and just use the funeral director for what he can do that they can't.
To help
Right.
facilitate and make the process smoother
Yep.
for everyone involved. So, now, I know that you mentioned websites, and many more funeral homes today have websites where people can post condolences, and you're
Right.
seeing a lot more electronic sympathy cards basically
Yes.
being sent and
Yes.
so forth.
Yeah, and it's nice because families are spread out across the country, and even if family can make it home, sometimes close friends of those family members in those other
Right.
locations want to be a part of the process,
Sure.
and the website offers
real
that.
handy.
To electronic. And we're talking about, and we mentioned memorials earlier on, a lot of times I'm hearing more people are doing that memorial presentation at a funeral where there's a slideshow or pictures and so forth. So there's a lot of, as you said earlier, new ways of having funerals.
Right. Yeah. Our website has any pictures they bring in, we put on the slide on the so the people again at a remote distance can watch the slideshow on the internet. So it is kind of a nice tool to bring the community together, even though we're far apart.
Right. Now, post-funeral services for families that are still grieving or going through that process, that.
It's there are some organizations and what I should say is maybe what I have a conviction about here, what I believe. I think your best resource is your own family, and your church and your minister. There are some groups that get together, and it's great socialization. But
Support groups.
right,
And things like that.
it's not so professional as maybe, and maybe not even as effective as what your own support
The people
system
you know.
can be. The other thing is you have to be aware of is marketing is done through some of that support system, and so obviously the best time for people to think about making their own prearrangement is after they've lost someone, and there are those who would take advantage of that, and so just be careful that you're who you look to for support. Now again, hospice has a great follow-up program.
families.
Their chaplain will follow up. They have a grief coordinator who follows up afterwards, and so if you have used the services of hospice, you have that as part of the
That's a
the
wonderful
resource program.
service
Yeah.
from hospice, yes.
So it kind of boils down to making sure people become as educated or informed as possible in going into any situation.
Yeah, the problem that I see going down the road is a loss of meaning And some of that is created by just the culture that we live in. But some of it is being forced by probably the high cost of dying. And people are opting for less expensive services. They're shortcutting some things that probably shouldn't be shortcutted. Now, I'm not advocating for an expensive funeral here.
Right.
What I'm advocating for is a well thought out plan that meets the needs of your family. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to go the expensive route in order to do that.
Right.
And what I'm thinking of is just taking a pause. We're in such a hurry to move on to the next thing or the next event. And I think a funeral gives us the opportunity, I know I always attend the funerals for my clients, to pause and actually celebrate that person's life and what they mean to us. And I don't want to ever get to the point where we're just hurrying on with the next thing and we're not pausing and really celebrating a life well lived, especially with our seniors, what they've given to us in the community. And it's a time for us to celebrate them and to honor them. I don't want to lose that.
Right.
Yeah. A good funeral is a place where people make a promise to remember. And to carry forward the good things that that person has put in their life. Their light does not need to go out as long as you carry the wisdom, the courage, the good things that they gave to you, to take that gift and give it again.
Right.
A good funeral is a place where there's a commitment to family. Mom loved us, we're going to continue to love each other in her name and on her behalf. And so those are the qualities that make up a good funeral, and a funeral is a perfect place for those things, context for those things to happen. And so there's some wisdom in it. I want to expose my real agenda here today. I'm here to plug a movie.
Okay.
My wife is the general manager over here at the Hollywood 14, and they have she'll appreciate me doing this for her. They have a movie out now called Inside Out. And my daughter, who is a psychology major at Abilene Christian, we went to see it the other night, and we were impressed with the science behind it as well as how it presented this child that was in transition and wasn't allowed to let sorrow have its control ever. And the movie is a great parable that shows the wisdom of sorrow and how sorrow helps us grow and how sorrow builds community. And so I would recommend that everybody see that movie before they go to another funeral.
Tying into what we've been talking about today. Well, thank you very much. CK, I thank you for joining and providing some information for our viewers today. Thank you very much.
Glad to be here.
It's really good information.
Thanks for helping out as well again, Kelly. Thank you. And I'd like to thank you, the viewers, for joining us this week for Spotlight on Senior Issues. And we'll continue this series of programs looking at topics of interest to senior citizens and their families. Hope you can join us again for another episode.